Dead Space. Let's talk about it. Alright, well, I've been following the Dead Space series since it first began, and I guess I consider myself a fan of the overall series. I'm going to talk about, in detail, my experience with the 3 games, what I like and what I don't like. Let's do it. Now, the first Dead Space game is very close to my heart. I was waiting for a game like this to be made since I saw the movie Aliens. It had the 2 things that I really wanted out of a game. Those 2 things were traversing a giant industrial spaceship and fighting off hostile aliens. What could be better? The game delivered on both action and scares. The first time around, the scares are very effective. The atmosphere is brooding and ambient, and there are a lot of things that jump out at you. The xenomorphs are of a wide variety. They're pretty scary, and they do the trick of acting as space zombies. And there are times when things get very intense while fighting them. The game uses light tricks and psychological elements to help get the fear across. Overall, the game's pretty scary, but now that I've had some time, when I look back, I have to ask myself, is all of that really truly effective after a while? Like I said, after you play the game once, the effectiveness of the jump scares kind of lose their appeal. A lot of the major events are scripted, so you know when they're going to happen. And I give the game points for its psychological element, but in the long run, it's just not as scary as other games have been. The game's psycho twist is really easy to anticipate, especially if you're a gamer who's ever played Silent Hill 2 before. Still, I give the game credit just for having them in the first place. Honestly, it was more than I was expecting when I first played the game. However, with all of that in mind, I always ask this question: did I like the game overall? And yes, I did. I still have fond memories of it. I remember in particular that there were several areas that I was literally afraid to go into, you know? I knew something was going to happen, but I didn't want to go. And if a game can instill that kind of paranoia and fear in me, I think it's doing its job pretty well. An issue that I did have with the game was that Isaac was a silent protagonist. And, you know, I'll say it now, I really don't like silent protagonists. I know you're supposed to instill your own personality in them, but it just doesn't work for me. It's also kind of weird in particular that when Isaac is addressed by another member of the crew, he doesn't say anything back to him. It seems kind of strange to me, and also it's kind of rude, don't you think? However, the joke is on me, it turns out. Because Isaac is a silent protagonist, I had to fill in a lot of the blanks about his character myself. I had to establish a headcanon about what Isaac was all about. And because I went through that, I kind of firsthand went through all like the crazy intensity that game entails. I had to figure out what Isaac's relation to the rest of the crew was, and I had to figure out his relations to Nicole and how he felt about that. And also something that I want to say to the game's credit is that in that first game, it does a really good job of building a universe. And when I say building a universe, it builds a lot more storyline than what goes on within the walls of that spaceship. They establish a government, they establish a whole bunch of backstory, they establish a whole bunch of religious nonsense that's going on, which made it pretty prime for sequels. Dead Space! But when I think about all of that, all of the events of the first game, what it really is a build-up to Dead Space 2. I fucking love Dead Space 2. It's definitely up there with my favorite games of all time. It's intense, scary as hell, and balances action with brooding fear pretty well. It's got all the things that make the first Dead Space good, but it includes something that was missing: a character arc. Isaac is no longer a silent protagonist going around stomping on shit. He's a fully fleshed character going through some seriously bad juju. Isaac is now played by Gunnar Wright, and he gives him a very working man kind of personality, mixed with the personality of a post-traumatic stress disorder victim. In this game, Isaac is not just fighting necromorphs, he's trying to reconcile the horrors and guilt that brought him here now. The action of the story is merely a framing device, and that's what makes it stand out. The game also introduces new characters, and they're all fine, but none as important as Ellie Langford, played by Sonita Henry, who is quite honestly a babe. I'll talk about her in a bit. On top of a solid arc for the leading character, we have a sense of urgency within the game as the stakes are raised a lot higher than on the USG Ishimura. One of the ways they illustrate that is by showing the necromorph outbreak as it occurs instead of after the fact. You'll see hapless people get attacked, mass evacuations, and even some really poignant aftermath. One of the most chilling pieces to that is when you're going through an abandoned apartment complex, and you hear the cries of a baby that was either abandoned or its parents were killed. In all of these examples, Isaac is too late or too slow to help any of these people. pretty intense. So at this point, Dead Space 2 changed me from a casual fan to a rabid fan, so naturally, I was really excited for Dead Space 3 to come out. And did Dead Space 3 deliver? Let's talk about that. Dead Space. Now, some people say that EA got its claws on this game and turned it into another mindless action shooter. Well, to be fair, those people are absolutely fucking right. Dead Space got the mainstream treatment in its third installment, and by God does it want to show itself off. The fear, the ambience, the arcs, the intensity, the visceral edge, it's all tossed out in lieu of a spastic monster roller derby. And yeah, the game handles well, its controls are solid and the set pieces are nice, but in a way, that sort of makes it more despicable. They try to raise the stakes even higher by having the Unitologists take over the universe and unleash necromorphs on everyone. Right there you've lost me. I'm supposed to believe that a bunch of corpse-worshipping dudes overthrew the government just like that? Sure, I could see religious zealots bombing stuff and engaging in terrorist activities, but the game literally opens with them just saying, "Yep, they done took over." So they managed to outgun the military, people who are trained to kill other people? I'm sorry, I don't buy it. And you could argue, well, they use necromorphs to do it. Honestly, it's never ever shown or suggested that the Unitologists are smart enough to actually use the necromorphs. For the most part, they just go around assuming things left and right, killing themselves, and it doesn't help that they're led by Eddie Izzard's evil twin brother. Well, do you have a flag? No flag, no country, I can't have one. And there's another problem right there. The game starts you out fighting other human beings. In the first 20 minutes of the game, Dead Space is turned into a second-rate Gears of War knockoff, because that's what the kids like these days, right? Gotta play it safe with the lowest common denominator instead of expanding on your game in an interesting and inventive way. Anyway. The point is, they took the threat of the necromorphs and essentially replaced it with a stereotypical British villain. The threat of the necromorphs is really second to the threat of the Unitologists trying to control them, and that's just not as scary or intense. A necromorph is a crazy monster that only wants to spread itself and make more dead things. It can't be reasoned with. It's essentially a really aggressive case of mold. Fighting the necromorphs really turns the conflict into man versus nature in a way. Nature is pretty damn scary by itself. Since it doesn't have agendas, it just goes. Gears of War similarity doesn't end there. The game introduced co-op, another bad choice for a quote-unquote horror game. Nothing is scary when you're playing co-op. That was Resident Evil 5's problem too. When you have another guy who is armed to the teeth, everything seems a lot less harrowing. To keep up appearances, I played it on single-player mode and pretty much ended up missing half the story arc because of it. When you have What's-His-Name with you, they apparently try to develop a buddy movie kind of relationship. When he's not there, there's nothing. Certain areas are blocked off and can only be accessed by co-op. I remember reading an interview where they said, "Playing single player would not change the story that much." What a bunch of bullcrap. Half the story isn't even fucking touched upon unless you have the other guy with you. And while I'm at it, I have to mention how nerfed Isaac was in this game. In the beginning, they say he's still suffering from dementia from the marker. They say that, but it's never really touched upon after that. Isaac goes from PTSD patient to standard white guy hero. They keep trying to tell us that he's still suffering, but I don't see it. Dead Space 3 has no hallucinations like in the previous game, and no indication whatsoever that Isaac is actually suffering from internal mental problems. He's just really moody all the time. Besides, isn't that story already over? All of Isaac's development in Dead Space 2 was based around his crazy hallucinations and his guilt. He's despondent and he wants a way out, of course, but all of that begins to shift after he meets Ellie. I'm going to talk about Ellie for a second. I thought she was great. She was capable, dependable, but still a bit vulnerable at moments, and it helps that she had one of those sexy British accents. Now she and Isaac obviously have good chemistry together, and after he meets her, his motivation shifts from wanting to end his torment to trying to save another human being. That's important because this keeps him moving, and it keeps him focused, even though hallucinations are batting down his brain. Their relationship in Dead Space 2 culminates in one of my favorite game scenes ever. Isaac tricks Ellie into getting into an escape ship by herself, then jettisons her without getting in. With the hallucination of Nicole, his dead girlfriend, batting down at him, he knows he has to stay and stop the marker on the station, even though it means certain death and a fatal deterioration of his brain. She almost tearfully protests, and Isaac delivers one of my favorite lines from the series. I couldn't save Nicole, but I can save you, Ellie. Fantastic. That scene gives me chills and a lot of emotional response every time I see it. Even in the end, he's basically forced to reconcile a suicide attempt because of her when she literally rips through the ceiling to come and get him to teach him that he can't tell her what to do. In a way, she gives him a reason to keep going, and I thought that was a pretty good place to leave that. Isaac was damaged, but the connection he had to another person somehow found a way to strengthen his resolve. I think that's a pretty relatable thing for a lot of people who have gone through some emotional trauma in their time. But no, they basically undo all of that with a pretty poor explanation in the game, and Isaac's primary motivation to go and do shit is to make up with her and try and get her back as his girlfriend. Now, when you sit down and think about that in its simplest terms, Dead Space stops being a story about personal redemption and more of a teen romance story complete with an awkward and obviously unbalanced love triangle. Sorry, Norton, you never stood a chance. Now, I'm not hating on romance subplots. In fact, I'd be the first person to be all for romance in a story as long as it's done well. And to be honest, the romance development in this game is not bad. By not bad, I mean it didn't really set off any warning lights in my head as it was unfolding. But the point is, there shouldn't have been one in the first place. As a matter of fact, the entire plot of this game shouldn't have happened. Here's what I think. I think that in an attempt to raise the stakes, they implemented the end of the universe plot. Necromorphs everywhere, all the installations unleash hell and kill everyone. It's an unnecessary apocalypse scenario. They also try to catch the original fire of the movie that inspired the monster by setting it in a similar settings to The Thing. But think about what made The Thing's settings effective. They're in a painfully small research base in Antarctica, a small sliver of existence in an otherwise dead place. They can't even stay outside long when the weather is bad. It's claustrophobic, and the whodunit plot make it intense. Dead Space 3 missed that point entirely as it takes place in a wide open free-range snowy area as you jump from large base to large base. Again, not in the least scary. There are zero examples I can think of where I was afraid or even uncomfortable while playing this game. And the point is, this game is supposed to be a horror game. A horror game. It's supposed to make me feel scared and uncomfortable. I think Dead Space is better off keeping these outbreak plots confined to smaller conflicts. A ship, a colony, a small station, but not the entire goddamn universe. It's really spreading the lore thin. I like the lore of the Necromorphs better when we don't really know where they come from. We know that the marker controls their growth, but we don't know where the marker comes from or who made it. The game goes completely off the rails trying to elevate their threat. Near the end of the game, we step out of Dead Space and into Metroid Prime, but not in a good way. I think that Dead Space 3 should have established a new story with a different character. Isaac went through his shit and lived. Let him disappear for a while. Make a game focused around the Marine from the prologue, or even Carver, the co-op dude. Isaac could have been replaced by a whole new character. His entire role and plot in this game are redundant. They're rehashes of what he went through in Dead Space 2. And don't get me wrong, I like Isaac as a character, and I like Ellie as a character too. Gunnar Wright and Sonita Henry actually do a fantastic acting job in Dead Space 3, regardless of its problem, and Dead Space 3 has a lot of problems in its effort to appeal to the broadest audience, as they say. Fuck that corporate talk bullshit. You know what the really, really sad part of all of this is? As I sit here and talk about all the shit I hated about Dead Space 3 and how it really hurt the franchise as a whole, I'm probably going to play it again soon. Yeah, I've also just been informed that there is a DLC ending add-on that follow Isaac and Carver after they quote-unquote die in the final battle of Dead Space 3. Spoiler alert, they don't die. It seems to be setting up for another sequel, but I'd be lying if I told you that the fanboy in me wasn't excited about that prospect. And despite me poo-pooing the romance being central to the plot, my obsessive fanboyish OTP is already going through the scenario where Isaac and Ellie reunite. It will be fantastic, I'm sure. Man, being a fan of something is really confusing sometimes. So there you have it, my feelings on Dead Space 3, and they're not all that kind. But I have to ask myself, in my heart of hearts, in a broad, generalized term, do I still like the Dead Space series overall? Yeah, I still do. Dead Space 3 was not enough for it to ruin it for me. And I won't lie, I'm very excited at the prospect of Dead Space 4, you know. Yeah, they stumbled on Dead Space 3 a little bit, but I firmly believe that they can make improvements in the next one. I think that the brains behind the Dead Space series obviously have a lot of heart put into this series, and because of that, I think they'll listen to the fans. At least they'll listen to them in some regard. I mean, they're not going to overhaul the entire game overnight. But there you go. The Dead Space series. It's not very subtle, and it does rip off quite a few monster movie tropes, but, you know, that doesn't offend me very much anymore. You can still tell an original story using similar elements to other stories. I firmly believe that. So yeah, I've been ranting about Dead Space as a whole for a while now, so I'm going to cut myself off here. I hope you guys enjoyed my insight into the series. Dead Space!